This is a Power 98.7 podcast. Now we're talking. Subscribe to Power 98.7 podcasts in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. There's more on power987.co.za.
Our time is 7 minutes after 2 o'clock. Welcome to the third and final hour of the Power Zone on Power 98.7, the Thursday installment of the show. And we're looking forward to really just driving you and taking you to the top of 3 this morning as we start our Thursday in this particular manner. I have 2 guests that are on standby as we speak right now. Going into the last hour, of course, with transformational speaker and social activist Clement Chauke. Joining us, of course, as well will be Nikita Ruthven, who's coming through here as an activist. Nikita is a social media specialist, doing a lot of work as well around women empowerment and mental health, and we'll be talking to her as a survivor as well, where some of these issues are concerned. We're throwing forward as well, kickstarting a series of conversations that we'll be having here on the show, centered around the 16 days of activism, raising awareness as well around femicide, gender-based violence, and HIV and AIDS, the scourge. And this morning we are talking about the different forms of gender-based violence. So we hear that it's broad, right? So often you just see GBV, femicide, and GBVF even, and you don't get a sense of how then diverse some of these, issues can be, where then the abuse or these gendered power dynamics and inequalities are concerned. They are deeply entrenched in our society to an extent whereby we've had even the president describing this as a crisis, as a pandemic. But we know very well that this work that is on the ground, can it ever really then be enough? As year in, year out, we mark the 16 days of activism. So you're at home, you're welcome to form part of this conversation on 0861 987 000. There by X, we go by at PowerFM 987 at Katlego Legodi _ We'll start with Clement. Clement, good morning. Welcome to the show.
Good morning to you, to Katlego, and all the listeners of Power FM this morning. I must say I'm looking forward to the conversation that we are going to have this morning, speaking about the different types of gender-based violence. And I must also add and say I can't wait also to hear Nikita sharing her real-life experience story, touching on things that she's been through, and believing that this morning as we engage with you and all the listeners, there'll be a change of perspective and transformation in our communities in particular.
Look, man, it's all about really raising awareness where we can, schooling each other as well, but trying by all means to offer somewhat of a safe space for those people that may be going through the most as we speak right now. Maybe to also make that disclaimer to say this is indeed a safe space, and you're welcome to share with us, and we'll see how then we direct it and how we help you as well and come through for you. As I told you, that this is somewhat of a crisis here, even often described as a pandemic. Nikita, good morning. Welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. It's really, I'm very honored to be here.
Yeah, no, really appreciate you giving us your time. You're actually the star of this conversation here. And we're going to be driving it. And I was saying earlier on that we'll use you as a case study, but often just appreciate the lived experiences, because it's through those lived experiences that we tend to see how serious this situation can be. And we tend to learn in terms of how people have navigated this space in a way that we too can position ourselves to come through on the other side. So we really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Clement, let's start with you as well, and maybe start with just the definition of what has been happening here. We hear that it's broad, right? So it's not just gender-based violence and femicide, and then we leave it there. The different dynamics to it, even though we know very well that the oppression would be the same, the modus would be the same in terms of the oppression and the attacks based on people's gender and the likes. But there are various types of these gender-based violence. Maybe give us a breakdown of really how do we define gender-based violence? Let's start there in femicide, and we'll go into how then they vary one over the other.
The definition of gender-based violence, it's a broad one, and it comes as a relative definition. from community to community, individuals to individuals. So basically, gender-based violence on its own, its focus is more on number one, gender inequality, and how the other gender deem itself as superior to the other. In history, we've seen how patriarchy on its own, how males have, perceived themselves to be superior to females, and as a result, they have used their masculinity to exercise power and abuse power over women, violating their rights on the basis of gender. So basically, when we speak about gender-based violence, it's another gender exercising authority over the other, but in a sense of violating the rights of another person. And as you have mentioned, we have different types of gender-based violence. And like I've said, to one person it means another thing, and to another it means another thing. But so far, there are five types of gender-based violence which are popular and have been outlined. One being physical violence, the second one being verbal violence, the third one being psychological violence, fourth one being sexual violence, and the fifth one being socio-economic violence. And the most popular ones from the five that I've mentioned is physical and sexual. And often we neglect the verbal, psychological, and socio-economic violence because it's not yet deemed in our world and our communities as violence. When we speak about socio-economic violence, we still now, in our country in particular, having conversations about when it comes to job preferences or employment, men are preferred over women. And the second thing is men are paid more than women. So if in company X, they still exercise that thing of because you are a male, they pay you more than a woman. That on its own is deemed as violating the rights of another person. So it's GBV if we push the narrative that says men must be paid more than women. And just to touch on the psychological and verbal violence, people in relationships that they are in, mostly they find themselves being verbally abused, somebody, calling you names. That on its own is GBV. If somebody, the way they relate to you, it affects your mental health and it also affects your emotions, because when we speak about verbal violence, it's something that can hurt your emotions. If you are in that kind of a setup, I want to advise each and every listener this morning to say, if you are in that kind of a setup where emotionally or psychologically you find yourself being abused, deem that as GBV and go out there and seek for help.
Yeah, I'm glad that you gave us the distinction in terms of how then they tend to differ, but we see them just centered around the dynamics of one overpowering the other based on gender. And we see this violence then taking various shapes as well. But as you were speaking there, what came to mind was that really when you look at it, they can be connected, right? You can find that it's all in one, whereby the physical would come through with the sexual, and then there would be coupled with the verbal, because then this person starts by swearing at you, and then it moves, it escalates like that, then they beat you up, and then you are raped in the process, and it just moves, right? And you find that really at the center of what has been happening would be the frustrations around the economy and the socio-economic challenges that maybe the man or the perpetrator is going through here. And you find that maybe you as a woman as well, you're not economically independent enough to move out of this space, and you keep going back because you are really trapped by the socioeconomic challenges on the ground that are happening. I tend to find somewhat of a connection here in terms of all of these things that would then speak to gender-based violence and femicide.
Yeah, we should also emphasize that it has stages, and there's no chronological order to these stages. To another person before it can become sexual or physical. It starts first as being a verbal abuse, or it starts first as being psychological abuse. Psychological abuse, we know that that's what we call gaslighting. When you are in that kind of a relationship, you are dealing with someone who has a victim mentality. So even when they stab you, they act surprised. Why are you bleeding? I'm actually the one who's bleeding, but how can you be the one who's bleeding if you are the one who stabbed me? So you are in that kind of a relationship. You are always confused. When a person is wrong, they turn it and point it to you to see yourself as though you are the one who's wrong. So that on its own can be emotionally straining. But these are the signs that you need to pay attention to, because one thing leads to the other leads to the other. It starts also maybe as a socioeconomic violence, where someone using their monetary status saying, I have money, and then you have to listen to me and all those things and do as they please. But like I've said, one thing leads to the other.
Yeah, no, that is very true. And I like the fact that you said it there, that, it's not a one size fits all kind of a situation. They can take different shapes, escalate, and you can see others even just going straight to a verbal, straight to a physical without it having started maybe from a verbal. And then you are confused as to what is happening now. This person is just attacking you, and psychological as well. There are also those long-term implications to abuse that would see a lot of victims then actually suffering and struggling with this over time, various of those triggers, and which is why then support becomes important for you to have people that really like-minded in terms of just coming through on the other side. And this is where then we also find you, Nikita, in terms of the women empowerment work that you've been doing over time. I guess you get to hear most about some of these, types of gender-based violence and femicide, and you tend to more or less would advise people as to how they move, and also because you have been through this as well as a survivor of this physical abuse, of this sexual abuse. Maybe take us through your story, and maybe give us a sense of where we place you, where some of these issues are concerned, or yours was maybe something that moved and started as a verbal and then it just escalated as it went along.
So thank you for that. I think Clement also summed it up very well, where you have different phases of, one relationship or numerous relationships in your lifetime that, kind of maybe just ends up as a emotional breakdown of character, which then kind of moves on into phases. And sometimes you're also in a situation where it could be just the physical side of things as well. So it's very, everyone's situation is different. From my personal experiences, I was firstly in a physical abusive relationship that escalated into a sexual abuse relationship. The verbal side of, the verbal abuse wasn't as strong as what the physical and the sexual abuse was within that relationship specifically. But there is a pattern that I've experienced through relationships and going through that abuse with different stages. They all have certain characteristics, for example, a controlling behavior, trying to isolate you from your family and your friends so they kind of have that control over you. There should be, kind of signs of aggressiveness, even if it's not in the beginning towards you, but towards, maybe throwing a plate or something like that. So it can be, it can escalate to a much bigger situation over time in the relationship. They also tend to obviously have a very short temper, and like what you mentioned, gaslighting is a very, very big topic. They try to break down your character so much that you can't, live without that person, because they take over your whole being. And to get out of a relationship like that makes it very difficult when you don't even know who you are anymore. So
Was it a sense of were you in a relationship that maybe
yes.
probably things started also good, and then eventually this person started acting out of character? And would you say that there were triggers maybe on his end? You were triggering him somehow, that he would find, or he would find himself here. How do we, or what do we attribute, this to, in terms of how then you would see a relationship starting also good, and then it just turns sour as you go along?
Yeah, I think that is the most common thing. Not all the signs are there when you're in the relationship, in the begin phase. And that could be a matter of, you're in love with this person, you think you can change them, you see, it might be a small red flag here or there, but it's something that you can look past. And as the relationship progresses, then it kind of builds up and gets worse over time. So in my example of my physical and sexual abusive relationship, it was, in the beginning, everything was beautiful. I moved cities, to live with this person. I was the breadwinner most of the time. He kind of depended on me, but I depended on him on an emotional level, if that makes sense. So it kind of started off as, I saw, for example, a hole in his closet door, and asking the question, how did that happen? And it was, no, my ex-girlfriend fell off the bed, for example, and that was odd. That should have been a red flag there and then. Seeing patterns with his dad, for example, also came into play, and how he spoke about women. I think that's also a topic that's very, I don't want to say overseen, but you need to look at the family dynamic from that person in the relationship. So if there's any attributes that you see in their parents, it obviously, takes place within their relationship and how they've been brought up. So when I looked at his father, for example, there were already signs of, degrading women in any conversation, even in front of me. So there was that lack of respect from the beginning. And that should have also been a sign for me. And I think also in South Africa, because we have so many various cultures as well, it's so important to place yourself and be sure to see how a family, your partner's family is set up, and how they treat women and how they treat men, for example. It gives you a good idea of how that person was brought up. Within a emotional abusive relationship that I was also in, there were clear signs from the beginning where I just said, no, it's nothing to be worried about. It will change. I can change this person. And it just escalated from there to the point where he controlled what I wear, he controlled who I talk to. And as soon as you open your eyes, you're already so deep within that relationship, or even married to the person, where you only realize, no, this is not the life I've planned for myself.
And then when you look at really how, some of these red flags would tend to lead us to where we find ourselves now, would you advise someone to say, really immediately when you see some of these things, get out? And would you say that with the people that you tend to interact with, do you find that, some of these things become so prevalent at a later stage of the relationship, and you ignoring them, it's just something that could lead you then to a disaster in the near future? How do we then navigate this one? Because people would often talk about these, honeymoon phase of a relationship, for instance, whereby you hear a lot of survivors saying that particular phase is a trap. If you really are not vigilant around that time, then it becomes a little bit of a tide, and it's harder for you then to get out of this relationship, because it has really built more than you can actually control it. What do you say to people when they actually come through to say, really, I find myself in this rut? Do you basically say to them, run, or there could actually be avenues of working through a relationship with someone also who is a perpetrator of gender-based violence?
So I think, like you mentioned, the honeymoon phase is so you have to be so cautious within that space because, like I mentioned, abusers might only show, signs when you are perhaps already living with them, married to them, for example. These things can build up over numerous years. So it's so difficult to pinpoint exactly when, there are certain red flags, if you want to call them that, in the beginning of a relationship that you are looking through rose-tinted glasses and thinking, this is not that bad. I can look over it, look past it. But what I would say is as soon as you see warning signs from the beginning of your relationship, even if it's the smallest thing that might, make you feel unsafe, then it is a good sign to rather get out of that relationship in the most safest way possible, even if it means, living with a friend for a while, not confronting your abuser in the beginning. Just leave as much as you can and kind of move away from your abuser and that abusive environment that you've been put in. It's a very different dynamic when it comes to that. If the abuser doesn't realize what they are doing and you actually confront them, it could go one of two ways, which is usually the way of them retaliating and you getting yourself into a more unsafe environment that you were in before you had the conversation, which is why I said don't even try to have a conversation with that person. If they're not willing to change and they're not willing to see their faults and their flaws, then you already know, okay, this is not going to work. If you can't change a person who doesn't want to change or who doesn't realize what they are doing and how it affects you as a person.
Clement, can we navigate it? Can we work through it, as a couple here? When I find that, there are some areas, the red flags and everything else in between, would I be too ambitious to think that maybe, this person can change? Or really, are we in any way just doing a disservice to some of the people that have gone through some of these issues by not giving them that opportunity to prove themselves on the other side, to say you can change and give you the benefit of the doubt and their likes? Do I give you that benefit of the doubt, maybe standing from the side to say, work on yourself and then I'll come back into the relationship? Or when you look at it, looking at the work that you've been doing over time, there is a way that we can navigate through it as a couple here, as we know very well that most of these, the violence and the femicide would come from intimate relations. So when you look at what has been happening, can you actually turn a corner as a perpetrator here? Can we actually really give you somewhat of a grace here, looking at what maybe you may be going through or experiencing that could have led you to, acting out the way that you had acted out?
That question that is a broad one, but I'm gonna do my best to answer it. I think the safe space for us to tackle that question is when we touch on relationships in particular. So when we get into a relationship with another person, oftentimes in the beginning, like you have mentioned that there are red flags, and the time that we fall into it, you get into a relationship at early stages, you can tell that there are 5 red flags that I'm spotting about this person. So this is another thing that I'm gonna say, of which maybe it may sound strange. What I define as red flags to another person, it may be deemed as green flags. And then when you get into a relationship with a person, you get into a relationship with them being themselves. So we often fall into a trap of saying, I'm going to change Nikita, I'm going to change Katlego, I'm going to be patient with them until they change. But guess what? You find that where I'm at now, I'm 40 years or 50 years, and there's that red flag about me that you don't like. And for me to get to that stage in psychology, attitude, it's defined as a settled way of thinking. For one person to have an attitude or a settled way of thinking, it takes a repetitive method until a behavior becomes an attitude. So if I'm 50 years, you'll find that in the 50 years, it took at least 40 years for that thing to build in me to Nikita spoke about you find yourself in a relationship where somebody's from a family where they objectify women. They speak, every time when they speak about women, they speak about them as though they are sexual objects. That's the setting that this person comes from. The rest of their lives growing up, they were raised like that, to see women like that, to speak about women like that. And then you meet with them, and then you see yourself as a hero who will walk them out of that kind of a thinking. Please, when you get into a relationship, you don't get into a relationship as the Messiah to save someone from their old behaviors. If in the beginning you can tell that what they are and what they do and how they think you don't like it, you are in a setup that won't work for you. To another person, when they get into a relationship with that person, those are green flags, but for you, they are red flags. So let's never ever fall into a trap of saying the person will change. Like we've said when we started, before it can become sexual violence, it can start as verbal. They've been like this growing up, and that thing is so rigid and fixed in them. But if you see yourself as a Messiah, I will say to you all the best. But chances are, in most relationships, that's why people will always say, but yeah, the signs in the beginning they were there, but I chose to turn a blind eye. Why did you choose to turn a blind eye? Because you had hope, and then you used your love for them. Sometimes it's not even love, because we confuse love with sympathy in most cases. I sympathize with you a lot, so much so that I end up thinking that I love you a lot. Let's not fall into a trap of nurturing a wrong thing, thinking that the person will change. In most cases, they never change.
Yeah, it's really something else. And we're out of time, but Nikita, just a parting, and I wanted to check in with you to say that, how are you doing, Nikita?
I'm good. I did consult with psychologists, etc. I still go to therapy, and that's also just a closing point from my side. Is you can get out of a relationship that you aren't safe. It's better for your mental well-being to rather build yourself up and grow from these experiences that you've been in, so that you don't fall into the same trap moving forward. Really see someone. There's so many resources available to victims in South Africa that you can always reach out, and someone will be able to point you in the correct direction. And you're never alone in this situation. There's so many people going through the same things that you are, and there's support groups for that. I really think you can work through it like I did, with the time and the effort, and realizing that you know your worth and who you are as a person is the most important thing, and nothing else should influence that.
Do we see you struggling with relationships going forward, and also people that you tend to interact with that also survivors that may have navigated the sexual and physical abuse? Do you find that would create somewhat of a challenge for you going forward, be it through trust or even feeling safe? There could be those triggers as well. How does one actually navigate this one as they pick up the pieces as well? Not also to close yourself off to say this experience should rob me of a future that would be blissful, because then the whatever I've gone through does not have to define me or define where I'm going. So do you find that for people as well that have gone through abuse, gender-based violence or femicide, it really then becomes a little bit difficult to move and to trust again, looking at some of these triggers that may present themselves?
Yeah. No, definitely. I think people do become more cautious of relationships moving forward, but I also think they are more aware as what they were in previous relationships. You tend to look out for signs much quicker in a relationship moving forward, because you already know what you have to look out for to not fall into the same trap like you did previously. I think it's very important to obviously have that support system as well, with people who have been through the same situation that could possibly assist you in that sense. But there's definitely a way forward. You just need to remember that it's a healing journey, and doesn't really have an end. Like, you have to keep on building. And like you said, there could be possible triggers in a new relationship where there's nothing, you're actually in a perfect relationship, and there are just certain things within yourself that could be a trigger, which is not really defining the person that you're with at the moment, but it's rather something that you still need to work through from previous experiences. So that is a journey of really self-discovery, self-healing, getting through that so that you can move forward and be in a great relationship and actually find the person that, treats you well, and that you can see the signs before it's too late.
Yeah, and affording yourself the grace that you all deserve to navigate this space, because often people would tend to blame themselves to say, maybe it was me, maybe it was, maybe I did this, maybe it's the way I look, maybe it's you know what I mean? Also just to not in any way fall into that trap, but to also just believe that, listen, I have come so far and I can continue pushing here, give people the benefit of the doubt, and also just go into some of these relationships. And the way I really relate with people, cautiously optimistic about how the future would pan out here. Before we let you go, Nikita, who are you on social media? How do we direct people your way in terms of the work that you're doing, the women empowerment work that you're doing as well, social media as well? How do we actually drive traffic your way?
So I am on Facebook, which is mostly where my traffic comes from. It's just Nikita Ruthven. On Instagram, I'm very active there, sharing statistics from South African cases, femicide to be exact. And my username is quite interesting. It's Nikita. So not Nikita, but with an S _ it's _ Nikita. So I can be reached there as well, just to build awareness. And I can obviously assist anyone in that space. If they do need help, I can always point them in the correct direction, and obviously keep it as on the down low as much as I possibly can to ensure their safety.
Nikita, thank you very much for coming through and for giving us your time this morning. You're our hero. I mean, really, I was saying that this conversation would be driven by your experiences. Continue being this light that you are, because trust me, there's a lot that it does for people that are navigating this, just to know that they're not alone. There's a shoulder and there's someone that can direct them into spaces that are safe, so that they're able to come through on the other side. Please don't be a stranger. Come back when we reach out to you. But really appreciate you coming on this morning, Nikita.
Thank you, Katlego. I appreciate it so much, and thank you for your time. I really enjoyed it, and thank you so much for the engagement.
Really appreciated. Nikita Ruthven, just coming through there as a survivor, right? Someone that is amazing here. Do check her out on social media, and she'll navigate you, right? She's an activist. She works in women empowerment spaces, mental health as well, a survivor of physical and sexual abuse. Joined, of course, by Clement Chauke. Clement, let's get your parting short as well. We're out of time, but let's get your take in terms of your key takeaways here, and how do we actually move?
So my closing remarks to the conversation is, there's a scripture in the Bible I love so much that says, "He who walk with the wise become wise." So basically what it says is, whoever that you spend your time with, you become like them. So if you spend your time with an abuser, all in the name of I'm in love with this person, vice versa, you end up also becoming an abuser, because the space that you spend your time in, it shapes your behavior. So I would like to say to all the listeners of PowerFM this morning, if you are in an environment that shapes a bad character in you, leave that environment. There's also a popular scripture that says, a bad company corrupts a good character. So leave any space that will turn you into a monster. We don't want to see that in your life. So those are my parting words this morning.
Thank you very much, man. Who are you on social media?
On social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, Clement TC Chauke, Clement TC Chauke, including on TikTok as well.
TC, thank you very much, man, for coming through this morning.
Thank you, Kato.
Sure, man. Clement Chauke coming through there as a transformational speaker, a social activist, someone that is an overall great guy, doing a lot of work in terms of raising awareness around these issues. And this is where then we were really breaking it down, the first of a series of conversations that we'll have here on the show, looking at the 16 days of activism, awareness around HIV/AIDS, and we'll talk all forms of gender-based violence as well as we try to raise awareness as much as we can. But you're not alone, right? Just know in this space, sometimes when you're going through all of these things, you can really tend to believe that you're alone, and the perpetrator can isolate you from your loved ones as well. So you can really come through on the other side. Give yourself as much grace, be patient with yourself, but then
You've been listening to a Power 98.7 podcast. For more podcasts, visit power987.co.za or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.